Course 3, Lesson 54, we are looking at angle relationships. So being able to say, what are these angles in relation to each other? And if we're missing some information, how can we find it? So we have a lot of vocabulary terms here, and I'm going to go through and put some examples next to each one, but also talk about are they adding up to 90, adding up to 180, or maybe they are congruent. So our first vocabulary term here, we have adjacent angles, which means we have angles right next to each other. So for this one, I could say angle 1 and angle 2 are right next to each other. We could also say that we have a pair 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. Those are all adjacent angles, but then we also have adjacent angles by saying we have things like 1 and 3, or 2 and 4, 5 and 7, 6 and 8. Those are all adjacent angles. Now in this case, these ones are adding up to 180. But in other cases, we might have something like a 90-degree angle that's split into angle A and angle B. Those are also adjacent angles, but instead they add up to 90 degrees. Or they could be neither of those, and we could have something like this, angles 1, 2, and 3. Angles 2 and 3 are adjacent, but they don't add up to 90 or 180. So we can't say a ton about adjacent angles. Alternate exterior angles are opposite outside angles. So what we have here is two parallel lines cut by a transversal. And we can say things like angle 1 and angle 8 because they are on opposite sides of the transversal line on the outside edges of the parallel lines. If we say this is outside, this is inside, and this is outside, then we're saying we have exterior angles that are opposite of each other. So another example is like 2 and 7. And these angles are actually congruent. So alternate exterior angles are congruent. Alternate interior angles, similar idea, but inside, opposite of the transversal. So we have angles like angle 3 and angle 6. Or another pair we have is angle 4 and angle 5. These are also congruent to each other. Corresponding angles, same side, same place. We're thinking about where they are in relationship to the parallel lines and the transversal. So my example is angle 1 and angle 5. Other examples are 2 and 6, 3 and 7, 4 and 8. Okay? And when we look at them, they are actually also congruent. Opposite angles are angles that are opposite one another. And for this, we don't actually need parallel lines. We just need two lines that cross. Because my opposite angles, my example is angle 1 and angle 4. But we could talk about 2 and 3, 5 and 8, 6 and 7. These are opposite angles, and they are also congruent. Now I'm going to skip down to this last one because vertical angles is the same as opposite angles. They are congruent. So we have, once again, an example, maybe angle 2 and angle 3 this time. Exactly the same as opposite angles, just another name for it. Vertical angles are probably the most common that you hear. Complementary angles are two angles whose measures add up to 90. So we're not looking at this transversal anymore. We are looking down here. And so we would say angle A and angle B add up to 90 degrees. They're not congruent necessarily. We just know that they add up to 90. Supplementary angles add up to 180. So we have lots of examples with this in our transversal. Okay, we could have an example of angle 1 and angle 2, or 3 and 4, or 5 and 6, 7 and 8. Those all each pair combines to make 180 degrees. But we also have examples like 1 and 3, 2 and 4, 5 and 7, 6 and 8. We could go further than that, but there are so many different examples, I'll stop there. Transversal, this is what we call this picture up here. We have two parallel lines cut by a third line. So oftentimes you'll hear that line that's cutting the parallel lines as the transversal line. The whole idea, though, is a transversal. So just to reiterate what we said about complementary, supplementary, if they are congruent, okay? If we have adjacent angles, oftentimes they are supplementary, but remember what I said about those. They could also be complementary or neither. Opposite angles are congruent, okay? When we have combined measures, we're looking at supplementary and complementary angles. And then congruent angle pairs, these are my corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, alternate exterior angles. These are also my vertical angles, okay? Lots of congruent angle pairs. And I'm going to skip next to a couple others because this is like what we did on the other page. But for this one, if we are given some information about an angle, so angle 4 is 120 degrees. With just that one piece of information, we can actually find the degree measures of everything else. So, and there's many ways to do it. I'll show you a couple. So, if angle 4 is 120, we know that angle 2 with angle 4 adds up to 180, so it must be 60 degrees. And it is opposite angle 3, which is congruent, so that would have to be 60 degrees. And angle 1 is opposite angle 4, so that's 120 degrees. And then we go and we see angle 1 and angle 5 are, they are also congruent to each other because they're corresponding. And so those are, angle 5 is going to be 120. And from there I can say angle 8 is 120, angle 6 is 60 degrees, and angle 7 is 60 degrees. All with just one piece of information. Okay, let's do just a couple more examples like this. So if this angle down here is 40 degrees, an opposite angle from it is angle 2, so that's 40 degrees. And then angle 1 is adjacent to it, so it adds up to 180 in this case. So we would have 140 degrees here. Now angle 2 is part of a triangle, and so we can say if this is 90 degrees and we have 40 degrees, that means 130 degrees are taken up, so this would have to be 50 degrees. And angle 3 and 4 are supplementary, so we would have to say this is 130 degrees. All right. And the vertical angles in this case are A and C, B and D, which means A and C are the same, so C would have to be 120 degrees. A and D are supplementary, so this is going to be 60 degrees, and so is B. Okay. All right. And I'll let you work this one up on your own, and same with this one. Just realize with this bottom one, this bar up here and this bar up down here are parallel, and each of these lines that go through it, every single one of these bars, is a transversal. So use your knowledge about transversals to figure this out. Okay, so we could say something like, if this is 40 degrees, then its alternate interior angle, angle ABF, is also 40 degrees. So think about those different things that we have there and make sure you're calculating them correctly. Okay, well, I hope this was helpful for your homework and for studying.